we're not gonna. There we go. Hello, everyone who is watching this by video. It is the 7th of November, and as I was just telling the folks, this is the 4th of our 6-session series of discussing Carl Jung's last major work, The Undiscovered Self, published in 1957. And we're discussing chapter 4. And if you haven't, you can download the outline for our discussions that is available on the link on the same page at which you found this recording. And every week we get a little better at our technology. I've learned that from my house, it takes 45 minutes to upload a recording of one of our sessions to a site where Trish can add it to the website. If I stay here in church, it only takes 6 minutes to do the same thing. So I learned that lesson the hard way last week. So we're talking about chapter 4. I reread it for the umpteenth time last night, and I just keep being blown away by how prescient this guy is, how insightful, and how much what he was saying 70 years ago, 65 years ago, is still so relevant for our world today. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time reading quotes that hit me. What hit you all? Any particular passages that left out that you want to chew on?
You know, I didn't know what you were doing, so I'm not prepared for much. It's been a while since I read this.
Okay.
So I didn't know how you were doing it. So I'll just be listening.
Did you?
Yeah, I got it. I got the old one. I didn't know if you were doing that where you were starting.
Yeah.
This quote on your sheet is
Which?
Otto's
Idea of the Holy. Which quote? The first one?
well, there's just one quote you have here on the sheet.
For session 4, I've got 3 of them.
Oh, there's one on the front page.
Oh, okay. Do you have the older version?
Oh, the first one.
The one that starts these archaic vestiges?
Yes, have a numinous quality that sometimes arouses fear. That was one of his major points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he uses that term, the numinous, and as we've said before, he gets that term from Otto's book, The Holy. Mistranslated, I like to harp on, from the German. The original German title is simply Das Heilige, the Holy. The English translation, for reasons I still don't completely fathom, they changed it to the idea of the Holy. That's not what Rudolf Otto called it. He simply called it the Holy. But this notion of a numinous encounter, that was sort of a new concept. And if I remember correctly, that book came out in the 1920s. I think I'm remembering that correctly. Rita, for you,
I'm good.
Mike is talking about is.
I just want to say that I read the chapter first
Mhm.
and I highlighted what I thought was important. And then I looked at your quotes and we had the same things on the same page. And I translated it to paragraphs and pages in my book. So I'm good. So
Okay.
I've got it. I've got the vestiges quote. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's paragraph
530,
530.
towards the end of 530.
Yeah.
So depending on which edition, if you're looking at the PDF version, it's on page 35. Now, and again, he keeps harping on this distinction between the individual, and in this chapter, he's talking about human consciousness.
Mhm.
In a couple of paragraphs before that quote, there's another one that I've underlined in italics. It says, consciousness is a precondition of being.
Yeah.
The
Mhm.
full context is, he says, without consciousness, there would, practically speaking, be no world. For the world exists for us only insofar as it is consciously reflected by a psyche. Consciousness is a precondition of being, or I've quoted him from somewhere else where he has said, all reality is psychic reality. That is, what you and I are experiencing here is a construct of what our brains create, our psyche creates out of the sensory input that we're getting right now.
I have to leave in 2 minutes, so I wonder if I can give my input really quick.
Oh, please.
before we continue. One is, I was watching the second episode, and an issue came up about a historical event that happened that Jung referred to.
The second episode of what?
The second chapter,
Oh,
the second video.
oh, oh.
And something happened in, Jung referred to an example of what just happened.
Yes.
That was a Hungarian invasion by Russia. I forget where it was, 57. around there. And the Russians said,
Yes.
Soviet Union said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be authoritarian, blah, blah, blah. And then when the Hungarians started revolting, there was a big revolution. Thousands of people were killed.
Right, right.
Massive armies.
That's the very end of chapter 2. It says how superficial the effect of communal propaganda actually is can be seen from recent events in Eastern Europe. And the footnote simply says added in January of 1957. So this was the fall of 56,
Okay.
that sort of revolt in Hungary. And I was 3 years old at
Well, I
the
was
time, so I don't remember.
I was looking at the second chapter, the second video later, so I could pause and look it up. And I was
Thank you
thinking,
for
well,
doing
that's interesting because kind of the same thing is going on in Afghanistan. You know, we pulled out, they said, okay, we're not going to be like we were before, but you know.
Afghanistan, Iraq, I just saw
Yeah.
a headline today that the Prime Minister of Iraq narrowly avoided being killed by a drone
Yes,
attack on his
a drone,
residence.
Yeah. Then there's one other quick thing for anybody who's a science fiction fan reading this.
Oh boy.
I got a big hit.
Uh-huh.
And it's right before paragraph 526. So this is a big subject in the science fiction world. It says he is on this planet,
Oh, yes.
humans, a unique phenomenon which he cannot compare with anything else. The possibility of comparison and hence of self-knowledge would arise only if he could establish relations with quasi-human mammals inhabiting other stars. And I have to say, as a science fiction fan, that is a big topic in all the science fiction books. Man goes out, however he gets out there,
Mhm.
and then you have the true comparison of humans with other peoples.
Other beings with a consciousness
Yeah.
is his point. And in this same book of the collected works is his essay on, guess what? Flying saucers.
Oh.
Oh, whoa, I'd love that one.
I mean, that was enough of a thing in the early 1950s that
Yeah.
we actually wrote about it and opined about what it was people were really seeing. And it's been too long since I've read that,
Yeah.
so I can't remember what he says. I'm gonna, Todd, would you close that door so as,
You read my mind.
yeah, as people walk by, we're not. Okay, thank you, Sandy.
Was he thinking of the animal kingdom?
Well, yeah, he's comparing that, the part that she just quoted is the end of the very first paragraph in the chapter. Which starts, it is astounding that man, the instigator, inventor, and vehicle of all these developments, the originator of all judgments and decisions, and the planner of the future, must make himself such a negligible quantity. The contradiction, the paradoxical evaluation of humanity by man himself is in truth a matter for wonder, and one can only explain it as springing from an extraordinary uncertainty of judgment. In other words, man is an enigma to himself. We don't really know how we tick.
How we what?
How we tick.
I want to and ask more about consciousness after your talk.
Okay. And the interesting thing, and I think I said this a couple of weeks ago, is that given the time in which he's writing, the workings of the human brain are very enigmatic. We simply didn't know very much. And that,
How do we think of it?
well,
Some of us don't.
as I was saying, with the publication of Alan Shore's book, The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy, and the advancement in imaging technology, we know a whole lot more than we certainly did 65 years ago.
Mhm.
We know more than we knew 20 or 25 years ago. Most of the knowledge that has exploded in the last 15 years was unknown when I was taking courses at Pacifica in the mid-90s. And so, as I've said before, if you had asked Freud or Jung, where biologically in the brain is this thing that you call the unconscious, they could not have answered that question. Alan Shore now answers that question. It's the right hemisphere. And a whole lot of other things. And his book, which has now been published at least 10 years ago, because I've been here 8 and it came out when I was still in Arizona. So probably about 10 years ago, and has been followed up by several others, linking neurobiology with the psychodynamic understanding of how the psyche works. But he talks about, and again, he's so far ahead of his time in the third paragraph in the chapter. For you, Rita, it's 527.
Okay.
In the same way that our picture of the world had to be freed by Copernicus from the prejudice of geocentricity, right? And even that was considered heretical by the church when Copernicus asserted that the sun is the center of the solar system, not the earth, which was the Ptolemaic conception. The most strenuous efforts of a well-nigh revolutionary nature were needed to free psychology, first from the spell of mythological ideas, and then from the prejudice that the psyche is, on the one hand, a mere epiphenomenon of a biochemical process in the brain, and on the other hand, a purely personal matter. So this notion that our consciousness is a byproduct of chemical reactions happening in between neurons in our brain. That's what he means there by an epiphenomenon. It's a secondary thing. We're a little better at figuring that out, but there's still a whole lot of debate about exactly what makes the difference between brain and mind. How does brain create mind? We still can't definitively answer that, but we're a whole lot closer than we were 65 years ago.
And out too, as we get closer to ourselves, we seem to be learning more about the animal kingdom. I mean, I think a lot more is set of animal awareness.
For the same reason. I mean, we've had that many more decades to study it. You know, how many words can a dog learn? Well, we now know they can learn a whole lot more than we ever thought they could. And then there's studies of chimpanzee intelligence, because they are our, in terms of DNA, they are our closest relative. There's only 2% of DNA that distinguishes a human being from a chimp. And so chimps have learned language, sign language, and talk with humans. Okay, so does that mean they have a mind? Do they have a consciousness in the same way that you and I do? These are things that Jung, I mean, he passed away before we got close to that. Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit more about the nature of consciousness and the factors that would qualify what consciousness. Like, does consciousness require self-awareness plus the ability to put ourselves outside of that ego, to see, plan for the future, to reflect on the past? Which of these factors actually say consciousness is beyond just intellect and ability and learning? Like, what makes us, what makes our consciousness obvious versus an animal who is more in state of their day-to-day existence, which I would say is maybe is not consciousness, or maybe it is, and I'm trying to put a human definitions around consciousness.
Mhm.
Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, the answer to that is just a tad complicated.
It is.
Just a tad. But in terms of what's the difference, Jung, in the next to the last paragraph of this chapter, brings up the Yucca Moth.
Yeah.
A good example of consciousness.
Well, he says, if we could look into the psyche of the Yucca Moth, for instance, we would find in it a pattern of ideas of a numinous or fascinating character, which not only compels the moth to carry out its fertilizing activity on the yucca plant, but helps it to recognize the total situation. Instinct is anything but a blind and indefinite impulse, since it proves to be attuned and adapted to a definite external situation. So now, if he can write that in the mid-1950s, the question is still very much open. Again, advancements, tremendous advancements in biopsychological knowledge and imaging since then have only served to blur that line even more. As I said, with the example of a chimpanzee. If, for example, the old argument used to be, one of the things that makes human beings unique is we have language. Until we learn that whales and dolphins talk to each other.
Yeah.
And then when we teach a chimp a vocabulary of 10,000 words, what makes that different? What really is consciousness? If, as he says, consciousness is a precondition of being.
Being, or
Well, of perceiving reality. Okay. And I think he would agree. A yucca moth perceives reality.
Sure.
It knows how to find a yucca plant. How does it do that? So, and he's fighting a much more, simplistic notion of instinct, which gets back to Freud's drive theory, instinctual drive. He's, without saying it, he's saying that he thinks many of Freud's concepts were good starts, but they're still much too simplistic. And he's trying to advocate for a more nuanced approach. By the time he's writing this, Freud's been dead for 20 years. So Freud can't fight back. But his successors, and there's still a tension within the psychodynamic community between neo-Freudians and neo-Jungians. I went to a big conference down in LA about 3 years ago on sort of the latest scientific investigations in exactly this kind of question. And of maybe 200 people in the room, there were maybe 3 of us who were Jungians. Because at one point, one of the speakers asked, okay, are there any Jungians in the room? What would you guys say? And there were 3 of us who raised our hand.
So is Freud still dominant in your?
Yeah.
Yes. In psychodynamic psychotherapy, yes, very
In
much.
big time, he dominates.
Yeah. Now, certainly modified, which is why I use the term neo-Freudians. So a strict Freudian, like every cartoonist, still stereotypically, if you're in therapy, they show somebody lying on the couch and the therapist turned away taking notes. That's stereotypical Freudian approach. That hasn't been used in 50, 60 years. but that's still the common mind. In
It became iconic.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, let's see, got to keep an eye on time, and we are rapidly running out. So any other comments about any other passages before, let's pull ourselves out of the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I've got some questions about the final paragraph on page 36 of the PDF.
Oh,
This one seems so dense to me.
how does it start? Because not all of us.
Well, it starts with the words, medical psychology is very far from being in this more or less enviable position.
Okay.
36.
32.
But as he goes through it, he's talking about the difference between knowledge and understanding.
Right.
And I'm not really clear what distinction he's making there. Is this?
Yeah, hold on a minute, Barry. Let's make sure all of us are on the same page.
Yeah.
Rita, for you, it's paragraph 532.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, which is a long paragraph.
Yeah, he's good at that.
Yeah.
How does,
Um,
sorry.
Medical psychology, on the other
Yeah.
hand, is very far from being in this more or less enviable position.
Yeah. So he's talking. Yeah, in the same paragraph, he's talking about the difference between knowledge and understanding. And first of all, I want to know, do you have this book in German? Is he talking about, when he knowledge, does he mean wissen? And in understanding, is that verstehen? Are those the two words that are getting translated here? Do you know?
You know, I don't know. And I'm not sure if I have this in the original German at home. I would have to look.
Yeah.
There's one volume I might have that it might be in.
Yeah.
But I think you raise an interesting point. Because I have done some reading of both Freud and Jung in German versus their English translation. And there are times when I, frankly, question the translation. For example, to my knowledge, Freud or Jung never used the Greek word ego. They simply say in German, das Ich, which means the I. Now, why somebody decided to use Greek instead of simply translating the German into English, I don't really know. They're maybe trying to make it sound more scientific, to give it an air of authority, because, you know, virtually all medical science is a babble and a conflation of Greek and Latin. And I don't have any formal study of Latin, but I have formal study of Greek. And so I can recognize some of the jargon. But I also realize it's polyglot. You know, some of it goes clear back to Hippocrates, and other terms are a mishmash. But anyway,
I don't, what is he driving about with the difference between understanding and knowledge? And what is this paragraph really talking about? What's the point?
I was thinking about that as I was rereading it last night, and he's talking about the experience of the analyst dealing with the patient who's sitting in the room with him or her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different from all of the psychological principles and theories and notions that you learn in school, which are abstract.
Okay.
He gets to that about the middle of the paragraph. With the growth of what both patient and doctor feel to be understanding, that is, as they get to know each other through the process of therapy, the situation becomes increasingly subjectivized. That is, in the mind of the analyst, you move from thinking about theory to thinking about the specifics of this person and their unique life story, their situation, and what they're bringing with them into the room, which is unique on the planet. No other human being has that. So it goes from the more generalized scientific principles, theories, understandings, to very specific, this unique individual who's sitting across from me in the room. And I can certainly identify that with him.
But then he's going on to talking about taking understanding too far.
About what was that? Understanding.
Barry said, taking an understanding too far. So let me continue because we're getting to that. What was an advantage to begin with threatens to turn into a dangerous disadvantage. Subjectivation, in technical terms, transference and countertransference, creates isolation from the environment, a social limitation which neither party wishes for, but which invariably sets in when understanding predominates and is no longer balanced by knowledge.
Okay, help me out. Transference. Yeah.
I'm gonna throw some of my cognitive behavioral colleagues under the bus here,
Okay.
as well as several of my clergy colleagues. Because if you're not trained in psychodynamic theory, you don't know about transference and countertransference. And if you think of the many times when people have either lost their license, or in the case of clergy, been defrocked for engaging in romantic relationships with their counselees or patients or clients or parishioners, that's what transference and countertransference lead to if you don't have the knowledge that that's what's happening in the room.
Okay, so now I'm starting to understand. You know, my one frustration with this entire book is I would love some more examples. He's great at I mean, his concepts are wonderful, and really enlightening, but it would help me in reading just to have more examples like that, oh, that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask, and if Sandy were still here, I would ask her since she's there. Rita, would you agree
Yes.
with my interpretation, or do you read something else into that?
Yes, if you get lost in the transference of the countertransference, then you lose objectivity. And but it's in the transference that the healing takes place. It's in the connection.
It's in the analysis of the transference.
It's the what?
We're talking pure psychobabble. The
Okay.
analysis of the transference.
No, it's in the transference that the healing takes place. But the therapist has to be aware of the transference and make sure it's that he doesn't get caught up in that countertransference with it. For Barry, probably not following me here. In fact, it's Edward Edinger says that, I have the quote somewhere, it's in my thesis, about you can have all this knowledge, but it's in the personal relationship that the healing takes place.
Right, right.
So that's where the transference comes in.
Shown that it's the therapeutic relationship is really the healing factor.
Right, and that's the transference that's the healing. The
Yeah.
problem is when the therapist doesn't realize it's his countertransference and gets all entangled in it.
Right.
The priest or the therapist or the power person,
Mhm.
doesn't realize. Does
Yeah.
that make sense, Barry? Am I being clear?
Yeah. Now, yes, I'm totally getting it now. It's just, it was a little too abstract for me.
Well, yes, it is, Barry, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Rita, I don't know how much you have heard or read Otto Kernberg.
I know about him, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and I've sat through several hours of his live seminars at the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference.
Right.
And he specifically talks about using transference-based therapy for the treatment of borderline personality disorder.
Oh, yes.
Because
I have a lot of experience with that.
yeah, and again, that's analyzing the transference and making that unconscious process conscious for the patient so that they understand what in their own psyche is connecting with the therapist in such a way to create that transference relationship.
Donald Winnicott has a great book that he wrote after the woman passed away, Margaret Little.
Yeah,
It was Donald Winnicott started, he was a baby doctor and he observed mothers, and then he got into the psychodynamics. He's object relations. They wanted him to join the Jungian group and he didn't. But it is in that holding in that, and he worked with a lot of borderline patients.
Yeah, yeah. Kernberg and Winnicott are very much rooted in
Right.
relations.
So what happens is
Now
that
we're talking
the therapist becomes like,
Let's not go
yeah,
too much further down.
so Barry, the therapist becomes the holding parent that the child didn't have. But the therapist has to recognize it. And at some point, the client has also to recognize it, or it gets all, you get in trouble.
Yeah.
My parish priest told me last week, he said he had a parishioner that was coming to him and he was trying to explain to her about her transference, and she just went berserk. No, I don't have a transference to you,
Yeah. Methinks she doth protest too much. Yeah. So
Is that
Barry,
clear,
thank you
Barry?
for that question.
Yeah, well, without taking all the courses and so forth, I think it's as clear as it's going to be right now.
Okay.
I would have to do a lot of reading before I was, any deeper into it, I think.
Yeah, you just have to get a PhD in clinical science.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Moving on. This has been fun so far. We've got about another 10 to 15 minutes before we'll need to close up. So any other pieces to talk about? Towards the end of the chapter, this one, well, there's a couple. In the middle of paragraph 536, and I've quoted it on the handout, the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. I said, it is, and again, to give the context, it is unfortunately only too clear that if the individual is not truly regenerated in spirit, society cannot be either. For society is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption. I can therefore see it only as a delusion when the churches try, as they apparently do, to rope the individual into some social organization and reduce him to a condition of diminished responsibility, instead of raising him out of the torpid, mindless mass and making clear to him that he or she, I'm updating Jung, is the one important factor, and that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual. Again, he's making this very conscious contrast between the church as simply another mass organization in which people lose themselves versus the religious experience, which is a uniquely individual thing. And he repeatedly points to the examples of Jesus and Paul.
Can I ask you a question about
Sure.
religious experience? To me, when I hear people expressing it, when I express it myself, I use language and metaphors that come from the church. That's the language that I use for it. And it's not adequate.
Have you read Otto's book?
I haven't read much.
Okay. You might find that interesting because that is the whole point of his book. And again, it's now 100 years old.
Is Otto listed on this?
Otto, Rudolf Otto. No, because I didn't add a bibliography. Again, in English, Rudolf Otto, O-T-T-O. And the English translation is called The Idea of the Holy.
It's an excellent book.
Yeah, and again, it was required reading.
The idea of what?
The Idea of the Holy. And again, this is my pet peeve because the original German is simply the holy, das Heilige. But so Jung, when Jung uses the term numinous, he's getting that from Otto. So his book is an attempt in a typical sort of German academic way to explain religious experience, those powerful knock you on your ass on the road to Damascus kinds of encounters with the other. And that's what the whole book is about. And as I said, it had a profound effect on Jung at about the time when Jung and Freud are fracturing, splitting off, in part because of disagreement between Freud and Jung over the whole notion of religion. Because if you recall, Freud in 26, mid-20s, wrote a paper called The Future of an Illusion, in which he argued that humanity invented the idea of God
Yeah. Mhm.
to explain the unexplainable that man encountered in the universe. Natural phenomenon, thunder and lightning and storms and death and illness and all those things. And Freud was arguing that as scientific knowledge progresses and increases, we won't need the concept of a God anymore to explain these things because science will explain them. And again, as an undergraduate, I took a philosophy of religion course, and that was one of the required readings, was Freud's The Future of an Illusion.
Right.
And Jung disagreed vehemently with that notion. And it's one of the things that caused the split between the two of them in the 20s.
Right. Amongst other things, but yes, it's basically in a short,
And I'm going to put this.
Jung said he knows there's a God, and Freud says is an atheist, kind of. So you've got the two.
Right.
So I think once you put it in language, you're off the track. Automatic. And if we want to switch over to scientific language. I think it's
Okay, so I've just posted in the chat the reference to Rudolf Otto, the idea of the holy, and Sigmund Freud, Future of an Illusion. And that I do have in German. I have a collection of Freud's essays in German, and I can't now recall the German word that is translated with the English illusion. I don't remember, it's just an idea. He uses Idee, which is idea, or a more technical term. So, okay, we got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to call attention to a couple of paragraphs later. In 538, the one that begins with all mass movements, as one might expect, slip with greatest ease down an inclined plane made up of large numbers. Where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must, of course, be true. You should be thinking about some very recent events. What the many want must be worth striving for and necessary and therefore good. In the clamor of the many resides the power to snatch wish fulfillments by force. Sweetest of all, however, is that gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood and to the paradise of parental care and to happy-go-luckiness and irresponsibility. All the thinking and looking after are done from the top. To all questions, there is an answer. And for all needs, the necessary provision is made. The infantile dream state of the mass man is so unrealistic that he never thinks to ask who is paying for this paradise. The balancing of accounts is left to a higher political or social authority, which welcomes the task, for its power is thereby increased. And the more power it has, the weaker and more helpless the individual becomes. This made me think of an essay that was popular in the 1960s by a guy named Eric Hoffer.
Eric Hoffer?
Yeah, Eric Hoffer, who was a longshoreman in San Francisco, but a very deep thinker for his time. And he wrote an essay called The True Believer. And it's on, exactly on point with this, written about probably 10 years after Freud, right? So he's reflecting on mass movements, and this is in the midst of the turmoil of the social and anti-war movements of the 1960s. So what makes somebody join a group, become part of a mass? Now, in the case of, some of the social upheaval movements of the 60s, we say, well, those were good things, weren't they? I mean, didn't we free a lot of people? But it seems the good die young. I'm quoting
Right.
Abraham, Martin, and John, being a child of the 60s.
I think Abby Hoffman.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the,
Could you guys hear what Heather just said?
No.
She said, I think Abby Hoffman became a life insurance salesman. Yes. And then there was Tom Hayden.
I don't know what is essential about communicating it to someone else, the experience. I think that's where we get into trouble, and we build this herd mentality, and people are not relating it to a personal experience, they're relating it to intellectual. And that's where I think, I'm okay with the idea of the holy, because I think very quickly the holy gets lost in the idea.
That again, based on Jung's recent experience, he's highly skeptical of
What was his reason?
World War II.
Oh, well, sorry.
Yeah. Well, he's writing in the mid-1950s, so it's very fresh in mind. And in fact, if we go back a couple of paragraphs to paragraph 535, so, and if you're in your...
It's meaningless for me with this book.
Yeah, the paragraph that begins, as the dialectical discussion proceeds, a point is reached when an evaluation of these individual impulses become necessary. Skipping down towards the second or last third of the paragraph. So naturally, society has an indisputable right to protect itself against errant subjectivisms. So how do we balance the rights of society against the rights of individuals? We're living through this right now with this whole furor over vaccine mandates. My body, my choice. Well, yeah, but if you're going to infect other people, then that's not your choice because they don't choose to be infected by you, is the counter argument. And Jung is pointing this out. There's this balance. Society has an indisputable right to protect itself against errant, A-R-R-A-N-T, subjectivisms. But insofar as society is itself composed of de-individualized human beings, it is completely at the mercy of ruthless individualists. That is, those who would seek to manipulate others for their own ends.
That's why we're never very far away from it anymore.
Yeah, good. Hold on just a second. It gets better. It gets better. I loved this quote. Let it band together into groups and organizations as much as it likes. It is just this banding together and the resultant extinction of the individual personality that makes it come so readily to a dictator. A million zeros joined together do not, unfortunately, add up to one. Ultimately, everything depends on the quality of the individual. But our fatally short-sighted age thinks only in terms of large numbers and mass organizations. And here's the kicker. Though one would think that the world had seen more than enough of what a well-disciplined mob can do in the hands of a single madman.
But they don't learn.
For anyone?
But they don't learn. It just repeats.
When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Unfortunately, this realization does not seem to have penetrated very far, and our blindness is extremely dangerous. People go on blithely organizing and believing in the sovereign remedy of mass action without the least consciousness of the fact that the most powerful organizations can be maintained only by the greatest ruthlessness of their leaders and the cheapest of slogans.
Sorry.
He could have written this 6 months ago.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
I disagree in some ways with that, because I think that it's not, the leader doesn't appear, then people band around him. The ferment is already in people. And then
Well, the
they-
willingness
and then they
to,
spot it.
yeah, and again,
Vehicle for it.
it is in the previous paragraph where he, that I was quoting, it's actually 2 paragraphs later, where he's talking about what makes people succumb is that they don't have to do the hard thinking themselves. Somebody else does it for you, which is what he's talking about. The gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood, into paradise of parental care. All the thinking and looking after are done from the top, which is the attraction of the totalitarian state or authoritarianism. Big Brother will make all the hard decisions for you. All you have to do is go do your job, collect your paycheck, and be fat, dumb, and happy. Yeah,
I just don't see it.
yeah. Well, that's what Orwell was talking about.
That's what we're seeing.
And Aldous Huxley in China, I had this flash of a recent news story about some military parade in North Korea. And line after line, all marching in perfect unison, goose stepping. I mean, it could have been 1942 Nazi Germany, but here it
Exactly.
is 2021 North Korea. It's the same.
Mhm.
The thing is, I don't know about China, but I was alive with the war, so, and I think that the argument I'm trying to make is I don't think Hitler appeared and influenced people. I think they were looking for a Hitler.
Oh, they were looking for some. As I may have said before, I had this conversation with my German grandmother. What was it about Hitler that made the people willing to follow him? And her answer, I will never forget. This was in the early 70s, and she had come to visit my parents in Phoenix. And I was home from college. Her answer was, he made us proud to be Germans again.
Mhm. Mhm. Make America great again.
Ah, there you go.
I didn't say that, she did.
I know, but same slogan.
Well, yeah, it's
Just
not
different.
the appeal to national pride,
Like national pride.
which is just it's not much of a push to racial pride.
Mhm.
And think of how Europe has been convulsed by the influx of refugees from the Middle East, from Syria and other places. And Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, consolidating their power. And we're seeing the same thing in Nicaragua
In Poland.
and Poland.
I was just going to say Nicaragua was on 60 Minutes the other day.
Right. And so the point is, this is a human phenomenon. It's
Yeah.
not unique to any country, race, nationality, people. It is part of, Jung would argue, this is part of the human psyche, which is why consciousness and individuals staying grounded is the only salvation we have to the threat of mass-mindedness, of getting lost in these. At some point, you have to step back and say, hey, wait a minute. What's wrong with this picture? Why are we being fed this paddle? You know, it's the
Yeah,
threat,
but you're, but
it's
you're
the threat of
the,
socialism or communism.
yeah, but you're the priest preaching to the choir. We all, it's the,
Yeah, I know. All right, well, listen, folks, we've got to quit for today because it's time for those of us who are here in person to go to mass, or if you're at home, to
I'm
switch.
going to Pasadena. This was this chapter was so big and full. It's almost like needs 2 sessions, but we'll have to go on.
Yeah, 2 more. Okay, Heather had one more thing to share.
That's the point of understanding oneself, because that's where it starts.
Yes.
I mean, we can project it
That's-
how.
That's why
And
the salvation of the world is,
and I think that where we get into trouble is we don't like what we see.
yeah, because sometimes reality bites. Right. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care
you.
this week, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.